from Isaiah is an announcement, really a foretelling, or the restoration of the Jewish temple, Jewish temple in Jerusalem. To understand the significance of the reading and the accompanying Psalm 126, which we also read this morning, we need to look at a bit of Jewish history. In antiquity, I say antiquity because at the time I had researched this sermon, I couldn't find a single source which had a guesstimate on when, century-wise, Abraham lived, made a covenant with God, and eventually migrated to the Holy Land. However, we know Saul ruled Israel around 1000 BCE. That's before the Christian era. So, sometime before, God established a covenant with Abraham and his seed. God said, "There is one and only one God, and I'm it. You are my people, and you will inherit life everlasting in heaven with me. But there's going to be a lot of water over the dam before that happens." So we begin. During a particularly devastating drought in Judea, when the Jews migrated to Egypt in large numbers. Egypt was faring better weather-wise, and they kind of had a hint that a drought was coming, and they saved up. So they welcomed refugees. As time went on, the Jews went from being merchants to being slaves. Finally, in the mid-1200s BCE, during the reign of Ramses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, Moses frees the slaves. After they frees the slave and they leave Egypt, Jews migrated to Egypt. During the 40 years they wandered in the Sinai desert, Moses used the time to remind the Jews of Abraham's covenant with God. And time marches on. Around 1000 BC, Saul, then David, ruled over Israel. After their reign, Israel splits into two kingdoms, Judah and Israel. And once again, life goes on for another 300 years or so. In 700 BC, the Assyrian Empire expands into Judah and Israel and conquers them. Life for the Jews now takes a turn for the worst, mostly because they've had some semblance of self-rule until now. The Assyrian Empire remains in control until around 600 BC, when they are vanquished by the Babylonian Empire. And now things really get bad. Babylonia lays waste to the land, destroys the temple in Jerusalem, and carries the Jews away into captivity. During this time, the prophets tell the Jews their exile is because they have forgotten their covenant with God, and that this is their punishment. For the Babylonian Empire, all things must come to an end, and so around 500 BC, Babylon's power declines, and the Persian Empire steps into the vacuum. Patience, we're getting close to the reading now. Persia has a more enlightened view of how to keep in power. Slowly, under Persian rule, the Jews began to gain some semblance of civil rights. Jews who wish to are allowed to return to Judea and Israel, and the temple begins to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. The fictional short story of Esther and the Persian king Xerxes takes place in this setting. The Jewish holiday of Purim is established during King Xerxes' reign. And here, finally, we are at Isaiah's reading today. The joy of returning home and rebuilding what was lost is beautifully expressed in Isaiah's poetry and the Psalm 126. However, this doesn't end our story. The Persian Empire in turn declines, and the Hellenistic period begins. The Greeks bring culture, the arts, theater, philosophy, language, and mathematics flourish. But eventually, the Greeks too decline, and finally around 200 BCE, the Romans arrive. The Roman Empire expands rapidly, and by 20 BCE, all the Mediterranean basin is under Roman control. So much so that they used to call it the Roman Lake. The Romans, like Persia, were big on ruling by allowing local authorities to control local people as long as everyone paid proper tribute to the emperor, mainly by paying taxes. And so we come to Herod the Great, who ruled Judah from 27 BCE until 4 CE, Christian era. Yes, he's the Herod every Christian knows. By Christ's birth, Herod was coming to the end of his reign. He was getting old. He feared the stories of a king having been born, and he felt he needed to protect the inheritance rights of his sons. So he ordered the death of all boys 2 years old and under, all the innocents. Jesus and his family escaped to Egypt, only to return after Herod's death around 4 or 5 CE. As it turns out, Herod's sons do not have the administrative and authoritative skills of their father, and in 6 CE, Rome begins direct control of Israel and Judah, and governors are appointed. This is the world Jesus and John the Baptist grew up again. And once again during this time, the Jews are being reminded by a prophet of their covenant with God. Over the course of time, the covenant has changed. Instead of, you will be in heaven with me, it became, you will be in heaven with me if you obey the law. Obeying the law by the book, so to speak, became critical to salvation. A huge bureaucracy builds up centered around the interpretation of the law. The interpreters gain enormous power and prestige, which eventually leads to abuses and corruption. Into this environment, God sent John the Baptist to herald the coming of the Messiah, a Messiah who taught about a new covenant, a covenant that stressed spiritual growth and consciousness, and a personal relationship with God. And he sent us a guide, Jesus, a Messiah who would lead his people through example